Trauma bonds. So how many of you have heard of such a term, trauma bonds, like the combination or the unification of those two words being merged together, trauma and bonds. By show of hands, trauma bonds. Who's heard of a trauma bond? No hands, and it's I'm not surprised because I just recently came to understand. Well, I just recently first heard of the term or the unification of the two words. But even more so, I just recently, within the last 2 months, actually, after sitting down with a good friend of mine, Charlie Price, he he's pretty much like a serial group home starter. So he started out 20 years ago in the group home industry as a young, just a young man trying to stay out of trouble, but putting himself to service to those who were younger than him getting in trouble. And so over the course of him investing his time, his energy, the moments of his life into this particular industry, he began to develop relationships with not only his colleagues, but more importantly, a lot of these youth who had been given up on, or who had been through so much that they had given up on themselves. And so over the course of the last 20 years, Charles has developed a particular and unique expertise in just identifying locations within regions to launch these facilities for youth. And so a little bit more context into Charles. Him and I, we used to be a part of the same gang. We used to be a part of the same culture, and we were pretty much addicted to the same thought life and cycle of thoughts concerning how we were going to approach our day, how we were going to navigate the midst of our day, and how we were going to close out the night. And so throughout this period of time that me and Charlie were gangbanging together, we had experienced some pretty traumatic realities in the midst of our quote unquote career as gang members. Some of them being shootings, some of them being stabbings, some of them being melees or brawls, so to speak. Some of them being, we'll say, functions or engagements where the gang would get together, and it would start out all unified and family oriented and community oriented, and would always end up with someone being hurt real bad, unfortunately. And so just to name a few, these were some of the traumatic experiences that we experienced together. Uniquely, these traumatic experiences, whether we realize it or not, they brought us closer together. You know what I'm saying? Like, not really understanding what was taking place underneath it all, like biologically or psychologically or sociologically, had no clue that there was something that was interwoven within these traumatic experiences that were like tying us closer and closer and knotting us closer and closer together. So fast forward, right, 20 years, 20 something years later, here I am, 41 years old. I just, launched a podcast not too long ago, called the Point of View Podcast with Timothy on Purpose. And, Charlie was a guest. And so we're speaking, right? And he's unpacking like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and adverse childhood experiences, which are, two of the major schools of thought or curriculums that, Charlie and his staff pretty much dissect, just to get more and more and more familiar with and to position themselves in more and more of a position to identify the needs of the youth that they have in their facilities and the needs of the staff who are aligning themselves with these youths to be of service. And so as we're dialoguing, he just mentions very casually, Charlie was like, yeah. And so, I noticed that, this kid's trauma bonds were very, very, were like very deep. And I was just like, and when he said trauma bonds, it's crazy because deep down inside, I was familiar with both the word trauma and both and the word bond, but I had never, I just grabbed a hold of trauma bonds and for some reason I was like, why did it seem like he said that in the same word? I never heard it like that before. So I kind of like interrupted him. I was like, man, did you just say, like, rewind real quick. Did you say trauma bonds like separately or together? He was like, no, trauma bonds. Like a trauma bond, and he began to unpack it. And I was amazed because I'm like, wow, like I never knew that trauma bonds could coexist within the same definition. Like the definition of trauma and the definition of bonds, I never knew that they could merge into a word that would describe and define why most of us who were caught up in such a traumatic life or such a adverse lifestyle of choice, and in some cases not of choice, but nevertheless still experienced, this lived experience of trauma, and are today experiencing the wrath or the adverse, side effects of it. I never knew that there was a word that described and defined the experience. And it's crazy because as he began to unpack it, things begin to unlock inside of me. Like I just went to certain experiences immediately in my heart and in my mind and in, just my being and in my makeup. I'm just like, I'm going back to moments where I was bonded even more to the gang. Like I was one of those individuals for those of you who might see, my appearance today. I look completely different 20 years ago. I mean, I still, if you, ask someone that's known me for the last, 41 years, and they'll tell you I look like I've always looked. I look like Timothy. But if you did not, if I would have shown you a picture of me 20 years ago, and then I showed you a picture of me today, you know, and asked you if you believe this was the same person, you wouldn't have believed it. And that's just, it's crazy. And maybe I'll do that at some point as we meet in the future. But to get back to the point, very, very like unanticipated. I was just looking at Charlie like, man, now here it is. Charlie's younger than me, by the way, like a couple years. But here it is. We're both in the kind of in the same field. Like, you know, he services youth on another level though, and I service youth on another level. Like pretty much like kids that are on probation, high risk probation, in and out of facilities. Like he services kids that come to a particular facility and have to be there for a particular amount of time before they're able to operate their lives in a safe and productive way outside of the facility. And so he's like teaching me in a moment about how him and I became so bonded to one another, and at one point would claim, bro, I'll die for you. You know, riding side by side in a car, many a times, like just looking at each other like this might be the last time we're breathing next to each other, you know, because of a traumatic event that took place. And now we've bonded ourselves to this ride or die mentality. Now, a lot of us don't have to go through those types of experiences to feel like you would ride or die for someone. I know there's some married couples. There are some individuals who have a brother or sister or a big family, and they're just like, man, blood is thicker than water. If anything ever happened to my brother, like, you know, we bound by blood and we gonna ride it out. And um, what I'm talking about is a completely different bond. And I'm particularly speaking about bonds that are all the more shaped, mended, linked, and grinded together through traumatic experiences. These bonds, as Charlie put it, are almost impossible to break. They're almost impossible to unravel, untie, unknot, disrupt, discourage. Almost impossible. But the reality is the word almost is there, right? It's not impossible. And him and I are the very examples of that. And so um, trauma being uh, an experience that causes some type of look up the definition real quick just so we can have it on hand and be very, very very like informed and not assumptive. I wish I knew the definition by heart. I probably should by this time in my life and in my career, but I don't. And so just to be on the up and up, we're going to go ahead and identify the definition of trauma. And the definition of trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Or physical injury could cause trauma, like something happening to your body physically, or something happening to someone else's body in front of you physically. And then, you know, we'll look up the word bond just to have a particular definition, and this is a relationship between people or groups based on shared feelings, interests, or experiences. And so in this particular case, trauma and me and Charlie's reality, interactions and experiences that happened between our gang and other gangs, ourselves and law enforcement, ourselves and particular people in our community, created deeper relationships between himself, myself, and all of those counterparts of the particular gang that we were from. And what that did was that forged this thought life of ours, which pretty much led us to commit to the death or to a life sentence in prison if be. We would not break this bond, and it would be unbreakable. Unbreakable. I'm sorry about that. It would be unbreakable. And so today, myself and Charlie, we stand on the other side of that commitment. We both pretty much like renounced our commitment to living or dying, like living in a prison situation for the rest of our lives, or dying um, a physical death, um, in commitment to the gang. And what led to that for me in particular was coming face to face with my identity. And how that actually came to be was me understanding that my name, Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr., was given to me before birth, right? It was given to me before I got the nickname Baby G-Man, or even before I got the nickname Lil T, or before I got whatever nicknames that were given to me, you know, post birth. While sitting on a rack inside of a prison cell in 2010, it occurred to me this one morning. I woke up and I was like, okay, I feel a little different today. Today might be the day. And I asked myself a question that I had typically asked myself every day. But today, just going into it, I just felt the difference. I was like, okay, why can't you stop gangbanging? What you got for me? Typically, my answer would be, because you know no other you but you, baby G-Man. G-Man 3, this is all you know. It's DVC until you die, or until you do, like, and as I'm saying, as these things are like, these things aren't coming out like they once did. Like, it actually just seemed like an echo from previous times that I had said it. But in this particular moment, I'm actually not even saying anything. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're not saying nothing. Why can't you stop gangbanging today? Why can't you stop gangbanging? And I didn't have an answer for the first time in years. Like, there was no answer. And I'm like, you can. Whoa, where'd that come from? What you mean? Hold on, like, who just said that? Timothy. You can stop gangbanging today. This is the day. You can stop gangbanging. You just got to walk out on the yard and you got to be like, hey, open your mouth and just let me speak. And I believe, like, this is my spirit repeating what the Holy Spirit told my spirit. The Spirit of Jesus Christ, I believe, told my spirit, like, right? And so now I'm hearing the spirit man, me, telling that fleshly individual, you have no more power. When you go out on that yard, you're going to feel weird. So just go ahead, walk out there, be weird, and open your mouth, and I'll do the rest. And I walked out there, and I did that. I turned around, I came back in. I'll never forget, there was someone who was considered an enemy to me. We grew up together. His mom knew my mom. And we were within the same environment within this incarcerated situation. And I'll never forget, like, he's the first person I seen when I walked in, when I walked into that pod, I was like, man, I gotta tell this dude. So I just walked up to him and was like, hey, bro, I just said it, like, my name is Timothy from now on. He looked at me like, man, I know your name is Timothy. Because we grew up together. So he actually didn't even call me by that other name. He called me Timothy, you know what I'm saying? But I was like, I don't go by such and such no more, homie. I don't bang no more. Like, this is just, and it felt so weird. But I promise you, I realize even more so now that was like just one of the trauma bonds that I had stepped out of, because this is an immediate enemy. We done shot at each other. Like, we didn't been through it. Now, mind you, we were two who kind of respected each other on a certain level, but it was just I'm like, oh, so, fast forward a little bit, you know, I start I start sitting in my cell on my rack, and I started proclaiming every day like who I was discovering about Timothy. Now remember, ever since I got initiated into the gang in 1994, I never walked the same again as Timothy Jackson. I did my best to run so far away from Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. because Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. was molested at 8. Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr.'s dad left at 8. Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. walked in on his mom shooting up Crystal at 8. Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. had some stuff that he was traumatized he was traumatized in earlier on in his life. Not to mention just all of the other things that Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. had just accepted about himself that he didn't believe anyone else would accept. And so from 14 on, he began to build up a self that everyone would accept and respect. And now I'm deconstructing that, you know, at 30 years old. And for the first time in 16 years, I'm courageously identifying someone that's known as me for the first time in what seems like my lifetime. And in a lot of those moments, man, in that cell, quiet, on my own, strategically placing myself in that cell during certain times of that operating day, I would sit on that rack and I would say, Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr., you're going to have kids one day. Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr., you're going to have a wife one day. Timothy Isaiah Jackson, man, you're going to have a career one day. You're not going to do life in prison. You're not going to die for the gang. You're not leaving here a gang member. And that it would echo off of those four walls, that ceiling and that floor and that metal in that cell, and it would come back and bounce off of me, and it would not, it just seemed like it would not, my who I was still, because I was so hardened, I couldn't saturate it. So I had to keep speaking it out. And that was it. As it would bounce off the walls and hit me and break this hard exterior down, eventually over the course of the next 6 years, I became soft enough again, and I'm not afraid to say it. I became soft enough again to where I was able to saturate, and that stuff was able to penetrate, and just really, I was able to believe it. And by the time I walked to my release date and step out into society, almost 9 years since my arrest in 2008, 2017, February 23rd, I walked out of that incarcerated situation Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. But now I faced a new problem. I hadn't been Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr. post incarceration. I hadn't been this individual since 1994. And it just seems like the world don't know me. And I realized that would probably be one of the best assets that I could actually have to expect a return on investment from. And I realized, like, the trauma bonds that I had aligned myself and bonded myself and forged myself to as Timothy Isaiah, that related more to the molestation, my dad leaving, my mom's and her struggle, my family members and their struggle. Those were the things that actually, like, were the deeper underlying rooted things that were left for me to deal with outside into this, in this society that I was walking back into. And I was all the more prepared with it because I didn't have a false identity on myself. Like Baby G Man, he could have never dealt with the molestation. Baby G Man, he could have never dealt with Timothy Isaiah Jackson Sr. leaving. Baby G Man, he could have never dealt with Dawn Denise Jackson and what, you know, me and my sister had to experience her go through in her life. He could have never unpacked this stuff. All he would have continued to do was bind me to more trauma, bind me to more individuals through trauma. And so I'm in the identity that I'm purposed to be in. I've arrived. And don't misinterpret me saying I've arrived, because I know what I'm saying, and I believe deep down inside you know what I'm saying when I say that I've arrived. It's something when you can just you can come face to face with yourself in such a way to where you know, okay, we're here. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. One step at a time, unraveling one trauma at a time, dealing with one restoration at a time. Let's go. You here. We here. Let's go. We've arrived. This is that part of life. Yeah, it's going to be more grittier, but you free now. You free psychologically, you free environmentally, you free logically, you free sociologically, you free. Let's get it. Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr., let's get it. Sorry to be so repetitive and redundant with saying my name over and over again, but you know what I came to realize my name means? Timothy literally, it's a Greek biblical name, right? And it means honoring God, right? Isaiah, it's a Hebrew biblical name, and it means salvation of God. Isn't that something? Can you imagine how empowered I felt? In perspective, right? Like, Baby G Man, you know what that name meant? You know, it was someone else's name. And then I was the baby. I was the third one in the family name, the third one in the family name, which means that I was under like two people. I was under two people, sometimes in a position to carry the burden that two of these people left behind at times, which at that time I definitely didn't mind. But now I realize, man, I was in a position to not only die as a result of the traumas that, you know, people within my family name in the gang had administered on others, but then just the burden of the whole gang, because that's just how I carried myself. But now, man, in Jesus Christ, I was becoming more and more and more and more redeemed. And I know there's that one wipe, bam, you're redeemed, son. But I find it hard to believe that every day I wake up and every day I take a step in this identity of Christ, in the identity of Timothy Isaiah Jackson Jr., that there isn't more and more and more that I have the capacity of redeeming. As I run into individuals who were considered enemies at one point, as I run into individuals who, for whatever reason, I hurt for no reason. And there's an opportunity for redemption. You have to believe that you will not be bonded to the traumas that you have experienced forever. You just have to believe that. You have to know. You have to believe it, and you have to know. You have to believe it, and you have to know that you will not be bonded to the traumas that you've experienced forever. There's a way out. And it starts with your belief system. It starts with the way you think about who you are. It starts with who you identify yourself to be and what you believe about who you are. You are not who you're bonded to through trauma. You're not. And you are not the trauma that has you bonded to who you're bonded to through the trauma. You're not.